Hey everyone, and welcome back to Cloud Docs. So today we're going to be talking about one of the most useful tools, I believe, in the IT industry, and that is virtual machines. So if you're looking to run multiple operating systems or experiment with new software or just create an isolated environment for testing, a virtual machine is a great way to do that. And the best part about it is you don't really need any extra hardware to be doing this. Now, you do need a fairly decent computer to sort of be running this, something with multiple cores. You really won't need a good GPU unless you're going to be running anything specific within that virtualized environment that requires graphical processing. But you will need at least a multi-core CPU, a decent amount of RAM. I normally would recommend having a system that has 16 gigs or more. Now, 16 gigs is probably cutting it close for some configurations, particularly if you're running this on a Windows environment. Windows alone is a massive memory hog. But 16 is a good place to start. Now, in terms of drive space, you want at least 100 to 200 gigs free for your virtual machine. Now, you can run virtual machines on 30 to 40 gig virtual machine drive size. So you would need 30 or 40 gigs of free space. But if you start adding multiple virtual machines, or if you're installing some virtual machines like Windows, which have a minimum drive size requirement, then you're going to need to make sure you've got an ample amount of space. Plus, you don't want to just go and max out your free space on your drive, do you? So usually I'd say 16 gigs minimum, multi-core, like a 4-core or more CPU, and at least 200 gigs of free hard drive space would be like a great starting point for VMs. Now, in Linux, there are a few options. You've got like KVM, for example, but today we're going to touch on Windows because it is one of the most widely used operating systems. So we may as well look at that. So what exactly is a virtual machine, or VM, as we would call them in the industry? A virtual machine is essentially a software-based computer that runs inside of your actual computer. Now, in enterprise and business environments, this may be on a server or in a data center somewhere. It's essentially how a lot of cloud infrastructure sort of works. That's summarized a lot, and it's not exactly accurate, but it's just to give you a bit of an idea. Virtual machines allow you to install and run operating systems as if it was an entirely physical, separate device. Now, this is great if you want to do some security testing and you don't want to risk infecting your main computer. And it also allows you to test network configurations as well. So you can test internet access via a virtual network, but maybe you have it set up so that it's segregated, or basically it means it's separate to your main physical network. This is really good if you want to make sure that malware doesn't spread across your network, or if you want to make sure that you can test certain functionalities or different configurations. Now, whenever you do some of the online training, like Hack the Box or Try Hack Me, you are going to need essentially a virtual machine. You could do this on your main computer, but it's not advised that you do that. Plus, a lot of these sort of training programs like Hack the Box and Try Hack Me are going to rely on you to use essentially Kali Linux or some derivative of that with some level of security tools installed. Now, both these services do offer their own virtual machine service, which is presented via the browser itself. Now, that's pretty good if you're starting off, but if you really want to try and have a better time, a better experience, but also play around with a few extra tools, those virtual machines that they offer are very restrictive. And it also, they're essentially an environment that is wiped clean slate every time you launch them. So any specific configuration changes you may make to make it easier to use, unfortunately, they're not really the place to be. Great place to start, but those are essentially a virtual machine. Now, you may ask, what options do we have to run virtual machines? Now, virtual machines are run on a hypervisor, and a hypervisor is a bit of software that basically interacts with the host operating system and the host system's hardware or resources. And from there, it basically allows the guest OS, which is your virtual machine, or the guest operating system or computer, however you want to class it, it allows it to interact with your hardware almost directly, not quite. Now, there are a few different hypervisors. In Linux, you've got KVM as an example. In Windows, which is where we're focusing on today's video, we're going to cover VirtualBox, which is a free and easy to download hypervisor, which is made by Oracle. And then you have HyperV. Now, HyperV only for Windows Pro or server and enterprise products, but it is a really great Microsoft focus. And in most workplaces, you're probably going to touch on either HyperV. You probably also could touch on VMware's ESXi, or you could also touch on Linux stuff like KVM, etc. But I'd say from my experience, majority of workplaces that are very Microsoft focused will be looking at using Hyper-V, at least in their server environments. And then it would be typically Linux or VMware. VMware is a big one, but I'd say Hyper-V is probably for most small to medium businesses is usually where they land. So we're going to start off with probably the most easiest one, I would say, is how do you install Hyper-V? Now, in Windows, provided you have the appropriate license, and I'm not going to touch on server at this point in time, because obviously server enterprise, you would enroll this via the server's features and roles within the server console, and you would add that in there. Now, it effectively sort of does the same thing anyway as enrolling Windows features that we're about to do here, but it does it from a server environment. And what we're going to focus on is, you know, what people have in their homes, which is typically Windows 10 or 11. I don't know. It is technically the same for Windows 7 and 8, but I don't think any of you should be on that OS at this point in time. They're all end of life anyway. So when it comes to Windows, right, the easiest thing that you can do is to open up Start menu, just type in features. You've got turn Windows features on and off. We're going to open that up. This will now load up this window. Now, as you can see here, Hyper-V is right in front of the mouse cursor. So you want to make sure it's ticked, right? Now you can expand this out for a few other things, but most people will really just need to tick the Hyper-V option. Go okay, it's going to go install it. It may prompt you for a reboot. I would suggest you reboot it, okay? Now another option is you could go to Google and you could type in VirtualBox. Load this up and you go, oh, that's cool. What's VirtualBox? It's basically just like I said, it's Oracle's version of a hypervisor. So we're going to go get started. We're going to go download. We're going to go Windows hosts. All right, so we've downloaded that now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run that. Now what we want to do is we also want to grab the VirtualBox extension pack, and that allows VirtualBox to essentially allow a bit more guest to host integration. So, you know, copy and paste support, certain driver support, and that sort of thing. I'm going to accept and download that as well. So now we're going to go through the installer. Wow, this has changed a lot in the last 18 months. It's so much nicer and cleaner. Run through. Your network interface. Look, it's going to install its own network interface to your computer as well. That's another thing that these virtual environments will do, or these hypervisors will do. They will install essentially virtualized NICs or network interface cards. We're going to go through. We're going to go yes. Dependencies, path and core. That's fine. It will install all that for us. Install. Cool. So it's now installed. Let's go and we'll start it. And while that's open, I'm going to go back to our downloads and I'm going to double click on our extension. Now you'll notice it opens VirtualBox. It'll ask you to install it. We're going to install. Go through, read your agreement, agree. All right, cool. So now we have VirtualBox installed, which is a free and fairly easy to use. And I'd say probably one of the most common hypervisors out there. Now there are some other free alternatives, but I personally believe they're all garbage. My preference has been Hyper-V, and that's just because I'm very familiar and very comfortable with that. When it comes to in a corporate or a business environment, I typically would prefer to use VMware's ESXi. Unless I'm going to be on Linux, I will 100% use typically KVM is probably my go-to. So that's typically what I'll end up using. So when it comes to VirtualBox, which is where I started my virtual machine journey, is we're going to go and we're going to create a new one. So we'll click the little new icon. We'll give it a name. Let's call this one Ubuntu. Now I should have a Ubuntu image on it already. So I'm going to call this Ubuntu. Now we're going to give it a location. Now this is where the hard disk or the virtualized hard disk will essentially be saved to on your host machine. So you want to choose a location where there's enough space. I can tell you now there is not enough space in my C drive, so this needs to move. So I'm going to go other. Alrighty, so I've navigated to here. I'm going to go select folder, ISO image. So this is an ISO image is essentially a disk image or an installation image of an operating system. Simply, as a great example of where to start, you might go Ubuntu, right? And we might go download. Right, we can choose our edition, so you can go Ubuntu desktop, Ubuntu server. Now, I have a Ubuntu server image already downloaded because I prefer to have just a terminal and no GUI. So GUI stands for graphical user interface. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to go download Ubuntu desktop. We're going to grab the latest, which in this case is LTS, which is your long-term support. this is essentially a more reliable and a long-term supported version of the OS. It's not the latest and greatest. There are different editions essentially you can grab of a particular version when it comes to Linux and particularly Ubuntu. But in this case, LTS is one of the most robust and resilient OSs that we can grab. So we're going to go and download this. As you can see, I've now selected my Ubuntu desktop image. All right, now you can see that VirtualBox has already pre-filled some of the essential drop-down fields or OS fields below. It's already recognized it's Ubuntu 64-bit. It's already recognized it's a Linux OS. You can change that if you were doing with a real custom or specific OS installation, or maybe VirtualBox wasn't able to detect what OS it was. Now, this is really cool because it has been a while since I've last used VirtualBox, but it now allows for an unintended OS installation, which is pretty handy. That's pretty cool. So you can feed it a username and password that it will pre-fill during the installation in the background, or even a product key if it's a Windows OS that you're trying to install. So remember, guest OS is referring to your virtual machine operating system. Now in this case, we can also suggest an installation of the guest editions. This is really cool and really handy. Now, whilst I would do this personally, because I want to run through the installation process with you of installing a virtual machine, I'm not going to go ahead with an unattended, which basically means in the background, installation. All right, so on the next page, we're now going to look at what hardware we allocate to this virtual machine. Now, bearing in mind what you allocate to the virtual machine, it does consume from your main computer. It's not that your computer would suddenly go, oh, my 6-core CPU is now 2. It just means that you'll notice your 6-core CPU may have more utilization, or your memory might be more utilized, so you have less free memory available. For Ubuntu OS, we really don't need a whole lot of resources. Linux is pretty lightweight versus Windows. So I'm going to give it 2 CPUs. Now I've got a Ryzen 9, which is a 12-core and 24-thread CPU. So that's why you can see I have 24 CPUs. Most hyper-threaded CPUs will always double whatever your physical core count is. Now in terms of memory, I've got 128 gigs, so I got heaps. I would say, in my experience, usually RAM is a bit more important than CPUs on a virtual machine. Again, it is OS dependent, but usually a system can be more responsive if you give it a bit more RAM. Now, look, we really don't need to give it much, so I'm just going to give it 60144, which is 6 gigabytes of RAM, or 1024 times 6. 1024 megabytes is 1 gigabyte of RAM, of memory. Yeah, you only need to enable EFI if this is an OS that requires it. There are OSs like Ubuntu that do support it, but it's not necessary for installation. So we're going to hit next. Now, this is where we stipulate how big the virtual hard drive is for the OS. Look, 25 gigs is more than enough on an Ubuntu system as it is. You can get down to like 16 if you really wanted to, but you can't do a lot, obviously. If you need more hard drive space, you can expand this after the fact, but in HyperV especially, how you can expand that depends on what type of disk you created during the VM's creation. Some disks are not expandable. Now, obviously, you can select a pre-existing hard disk file, but we're not going to do that. So we're going to go ahead with just the basics. And go finish. Okay, so once you've done the installation, if you find a window pops up where the VM's already running, hit the X and then select power off. And the reason I want to do this is because we need to make a few more changes to settings. With Ubuntu specifically, other OSs are usually fine, but Ubuntu, it may have issues launching, and then you may have to close it and redo it all over again. So what we're going to do is we're going to go settings, right? So make sure my VM's selected, I click settings, we open up this nice little window here. Now in here, you can see we can change a lot of features or settings pertaining to the OS. Now, the chipset, you can change what type of chipset it sees. For me, this is normally fine. If you need a TPM, you can register a TPM. Now, Windows, this is obviously important for Windows, Windows 11 particularly. You can enable the EFI if you need to. You can enable Secure Boot. Now, Secure Boot is only possible if EFI is enabled. Now, an important thing that we're going to touch on here too is that not all CPUs allow for parallelization or HyperVisor or virtualization support. So you will need to check with your CPU if it does exist. Now that can be found on the manufacturer's spec page. Look, I'd say almost all CPUs created in the last 10 years at least do have the support, but there are a few exceptions to this rule. Pretty much all the AMD Ryzen series do have it. Threadripper have it. Most Intel Core products do as well. I think i3s might not, and the Pentium and Celerons don't. And honestly, on a Pentium and Celeron, you just wouldn't run a virtual machine. Those CPUs are just too bad. They're just not good enough. So in our settings here, we're going to come over to parallelization interface. Now, for Ubuntu, usually in my experience, you've got a few different ones. You can use HyperV or KVM. Legacy and minimal sometimes work. Default does not work with Ubuntu 24. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a shot on HyperV and we'll see if we get it. Now, another thing we need to do is we need to give it more video memory. So I'm just going to give it the max of 128. And this is intentional because Ubuntu needs a fair bit of video memory. The Ubuntu desktop needs a fair bit of video memory to actually boot the GUI. Now we might touch briefly on networking. So by default, it sets up a NATed adapter essentially, which means your computer becomes essentially like a router. Now you can create essentially a more isolated network interface that's considered segregated or separate from the host OS, or you could just disable networking altogether. So you can do that all in here. So obviously disable means disable the network adapter, enable it. You can attach a bridged adapter, internal network, host only adapter. In this case, we're using a NATed adapter, which essentially means that the host machine's network interface card will act as a layer 3 device. And a layer 3, if you're not familiar with the OSI model, is a network device that does routing. Obviously, we can then choose the type of adapter. Now, in this case, VirtualBox is simulating or emulating an Intel Pro MT desktop chipset. Some OSs may not like that and may not have support for it, particularly older ones. So you may need to change around and see what works. You can obviously give it a MAC address if you want to give it a specific MAC address. You can also do port forwarding if you need to do port forwarding. You've got USB controller and that sort of thing in here as well if you want to enable USB support, which rarely you may need to be honest. We can enable audio if we need to. In this case, we don't need to. We can obviously configure our disks if we need to. So I'm going to go OK. We're going to go start and we'll see if this boots up. So while this boots up, I'm going to briefly touch on HyperV just so that you can be familiar with the interface. We'll go start menu, type in HyperV. HyperV Manager comes up. And this is essentially what HyperV looks like. It functions the same as VirtualBox. It's just got different layout and a slightly different setup. Now, if we were to look at, say, we want to adjust settings of an existing VM, which I currently have a Kali Linux one here, we can go settings. And in here, we can see all of our hardware security. If we need to enable secure boot as an example, memory allocation, resources, that sort of stuff. So it's very much the same. It's pretty easy. You can use a quick create, which allows you to download an image via the actual like the VM setup wizard that HyperV has. But as a whole, HyperV is fairly similar to VirtualBox. It's just a different layout. Now, because of the fact that HyperV has got a very small amount of accessibility for the majority of people at home, I'm not going to go through setting up a VM on that, but we'll jump back into VirtualBox. All right, so as you can see here, the Ubuntu OS is now booted, so we're going to go next. Now, if you're using a Ubuntu server, this is all virtually done through the terminal. The GUI has a few extra options, but that's about it. So we're going to go through, we're going to go next. Keyboard layout. Yep, select our network. We're going to install Ubuntu. And we're going to go with an interactive installation. Start with the default app installation. Let's go install Party for graphics and Wi-Fi hardware, download and install supported additional media formats. So we'll just do that just to sort of make sure that we don't miss anything during the installation. So when it comes to this section of the installer, we can now choose how we want to install Ubuntu on the hard disk and how we format or partition the hard disk. Now, for the sake of this video, we're just going to go with default options, but you can configure an LVM or you can change the format of the drive, maybe off of ext4 to something else. So if you really need to get a bit complicated with how your disk setup is configured, this is the place to do it. Once it's done, the OS has to be reinstalled to essentially change it. Otherwise, you risk nuking the OS. So we're going to give it a name and some passwords. This is all pretty self-explanatory stuff. Cool. Now, if we wanted to link this into Active Directory, this is the place to do it. Ubuntu 24 has some of the best Active Directory integration to date. However, we're not going to do that for this video. Time zone. Yep. Install. All right. This is going to take a little bit. Okay, so we finally finished the installation for Ubuntu. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go restart. It should restart the OS. There we go. And now the OS is installed, so we're not running off of the OS installation ISO file now, which is essentially, in Linux terms, it's usually called a live boot. It's a temporary OS. Everything's stored in RAM or in memory. It's not stored to a hard disk. We're now going to start using the actual installed OS on the hard disk itself. Now, if it asks for something like this, we're just going to go into optical drives, and we just need to make sure that we can remove the disk. The one thing with VirtualBox is if the keyboard commands are not responding in the guest OS, is you just click inside the black display window, and it should then work. Okay, so now we're at the login screen. We're going to log in, type our password in, and sign in. Right, now once we're in, we're not quite done. Obviously, if we had run the unattended installation in the background, a lot of this would have been done, but I wanted to run through this manually with you guys so you understand how to do it for yourselves. So now we're in here, we're going to go up to devices, and I'm going to go in and go insert guest editions CD image. You can now see that a little disk icon has appeared in the OS on the GUI. I'm just going to go through and just go next. We're going to skip this. Who cares? Don't share my system data. Next, and finish. All right, cool. So we now have an installed OS. What we're going to do is we're going to go in and we're going to open this up, click this disk icon here, and it'll open up the folder in which we're going to then run the software. Now, because this is Linux, sometimes you can't always just run an executable file and it'll open and install. Sometimes we need to go into terminal to run the installation. Now, in Ubuntu 22 and 24, with VirtualBox specifically, you can just double click to run the application. Okay, so as you can see, a terminal is now open when I clicked on the run software button, and then went run, and then typed my password in. It has now failed in the terminal, and it's failed because bzip2 is not installed. So what are we going to do to fix that? Well, we're going to go and open up our search function. We're going to search for terminal. In the new terminal window that opens, okay, if that doesn't work because you have that window open, just right click on your terminal and go new window. In this new window, we're going to go in Ubuntu specifically, or any Debian based OS. We're going to go sudo. Always remember sudo. At install bzip2. Type password in. All right, cool. That's now done. So we can just minimize that terminal. We can close that, and we're going to run this again. Go run. Type our password in. Okay, now it should install. All right, so now we can see it's finished. It says press return or enter to close the window. So we're just going to do that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to restart the OS. So we're going to go up here, we're going to go power, we're going to go restart. Restart. And we have to do that now so that the installed drivers essentially take effect upon reboot. All right, so we've now rebooted the OS. We're now going to log back in, and this is where we can make a few changes. So now we're logged in. I'm just going to go into display settings. You can right click on the desktop background essentially and go display settings, and this is where we're going to change the resolution. So let's go set this to a better resolution. What have I got here? Enough. Refresh rate 60 Hertz. Yep. Landscape apply. Settings. And now you can see we have a maximized window. How good is that? Awesome. A lot easier to see and use now. Now, as you can see, the disk icon's still here because the VirtualBox Guest Editions installation disk is still attached to the machine. So you can go in, you could optical drives, you can go remove from virtual drive. Mount. So that is how you install a virtual machine on a Windows computer, at least. I hope this has been somewhat educational anyway. I know we didn't touch on some of the other options that are out there, but this is a great start, and this does work as is with the current default settings. This would work for a lot of your Try Hack Me and Hack the Box training. Doing those sorts of trainings, you do need to leverage their VPN connection, but they do have instructions on the website on how to deploy that, and we will go over that too at a later date. But for now, this is essentially great. You can get started. You could open up Firefox or install Chrome. You know, look, the performance of a VM does vary on the hypervisor you use, the resources that you assign to it as well. So you're not going to get the best performance. And as you can see, that took forever to just open up Firefox then. So you're not going to get the best performance out of the box. It does come down to the OS you use, the hypervisor you use, the resources you allocate to it, and even some of the settings in the hypervisor itself. If we chose different hypervisor environments within VirtualBox, we might get a better experience. And obviously what I mean by that is these types of settings. So if we go into settings here, right, you've got your system, you've got your processor, you've got your acceleration, right? Our para virtualization interface at the moment is HyperV, which in my experience is usually the most reliable to use with VirtualBox, but maybe you need to use something else. So again, resources, you know, whether or not you enable any extended features, if supported by a CPU, you know, what chipset you may be using, whether or not EFI or secure boot's enabled. Look, there's a lot of different things you can tweak and tinker around with. Look, for the most part, a lot of the UI lag that you just saw is more to do with the display and not the resources we've assigned to it for CPU, memory, and hard disk. So you can enable 3D acceleration, which essentially tries to leverage your GPU. So in this case, I've got an RTX 3080 on this system, so it could leverage that rather than just trying to use a software-defined graphical driver or interface device. Again, with any changes you make, we'll either need to reboot the system or you need to make these changes with the system or the virtual machine rather turned off. You cannot just go and make these changes and expect them to update on the fly. But that does it for today's video. I hope you guys have all learned something. Feel free to subscribe if you like the content. There is more content coming, and I hope to see you in the next video.